No. Oh, it works, yeah. Good afternoon and very well welcome to this session on the criticality of building resilience against physical climate risks. I'm Juna Shrestha, I'm a climate consultant and Celsius Pro. I'm very happy to hold this session. In this session, we'll focus on the physical climate risk and explore the urgency of adapting to the emerging risk. And it's very relevant in this context where the last few months have been dominated by these extreme climate events, with the droughts in Europe to the floods in Pakistan and 1 in 1,000-year hurricane event in US, which alone, the hurricane alone caused the damage of more than 250 billion estimated loss. In addition, it's also very important in terms of regulation because now the big companies in Switzerland are obliged to report publicly on climate-related issues, that is TCFD report. Today's our session is divided into 3 parts. The first part is an interactive session, which I will go in a bit, explain to you. And in the second part, there will be a presentation by Samuel Brown on physical climate risk of businesses. And in the third part, we will have a panel discussion on resilience against climate risk, which will be joined by Mr. Antonio Carrillo from HOSIM and Julia Brandes from ABP Suisse. So let's start our first session. So you can scan this QR code, or you can go to menti.com and put on the code given in this here, 5917-2022. And when you scan this code, you will get a different options. What we want to do is like, where will you invest in the world? So it can be an asset, it can be in terms of debt or equity, or it can be your individual or through your corporation. So the whole idea is like, if you have a choice to invest, in which part of the world you are going to invest. You only have one option, so you have to choose a specific country so that we know. And I wait a little bit because everybody's doing it. So if you have any question or problem, just let me know. Yeah. No. So if anybody is watching online, you can go to menti.com and use this code, and also you can give your investment opinion where you are going to invest. And it's for, when you make an investment, think like you invest for a period of 20 years, not the 1 year. So it's like to think in the long-term period. So like if you have a maturity in 20 years where you will invest. So let's move ahead to the presentation. So the next session is about the physical climate risk of businesses. Samuel Brown will present on it. Samuel will present the importance of business to understand, assess, adapt, and disclose on the physical climate risk. Samuel is head of climate risk and insights and solutions at Celsius Pro. He and his team supports financial and non-financial institutions in understanding and managing their physical climate risks exposure. And they will, with the close collaboration, Samuel and his team also help to delivery of TCFD exposure. So let's welcome Samuel, and
thanks, Juna.
The floor is yours.
Thanks. Hi to everybody in the room and hi to everybody online. Thank you very much for joining at this late hour on a late day at Building Bridges. Really appreciate that you're tuning in. So just briefly about Celsius Pro before we start, so that you can put it into context. We're a boutique climate risk tech and consulting company based in Zurich and Australia, and we basically support our clients to understand what climate risk means to them, and how they can adapt to them, and particularly focusing on also risk transfer, so insurance solutions. And what we're going to talk about today is our slogan as well, is so we believe that life and business must continue even with climate change. And this leads to the next slide, where I just want to contextualize the debate that we're having today, but because it will be slightly different to the discussions which have been held at Building Bridges the last few days. So what I have heard at this conference the last few days is a lot about transition pathways, emissions accounting, and how can we get to a net zero target. And from a conceptual point of view, that is really in the climate mitigation sphere. Now, what we want to discuss today is really in the climate adaptation sphere. So we have a standpoint of, and I believe most of people that are here will have the standpoint of saying, hey, climate change is happening now. We're feeling the effects already today, and they're not in 30 or 40 years. They're happening right now, and we need to adapt to them. And this is basically the context of our discussion today. It's mostly kind of how do we want to also move the private sector into a direction that we as a planet can adapt to climate change. But first I think June already mentioned a few things, but first I want to dive into the actual problem. So what we're seeing is that global economic losses from extreme weather are increasing year by year. This graph here basically shows how not only the amount of different types of weather and climate disasters have increased, but also how they have basically exceeded various damages. And usually I have a few examples here that I'm showing, but usually, or in the previous years, we had to go further back to bring some tangible examples. But for this presentation, we didn't really have to go back in time to find some events to talk about. They're events that happened in the last few days, weeks, or months, in the sense that, first of all, the example that Juna brought up was the Hurricane Ian, which just hit the Florida in the last few days, and you mentioned how much damage was caused, and I've also been reading reports about that this event will trickle down into the economy for about 90 days, and it's affecting various different sectors, and therefore all the interconnectivity of the economy in the US means that it will affect an entire economy in that sense, and that is really drastic, and this is just one example of many where that happens. Another example are the heat waves. I mean, who in this room was sweating this summer in the office? For those in Zurich, we did not have an AC, right? So we were sweating in our office on the 8th floor, and it was tough to work. But that's us in an office. I mean, we had consequent droughts all across the world, where also in emerging markets they struggled with agricultural production, etc. One more other tangible example is the low water levels on the River Rhine. So those those low water levels basically led to the shipping industry being impeded, that goods could not be transported over the Rhine anymore, and which also caused trickle-down effects in the economy. And last but not least, which is also very recent, is the Pakistan floods. And there, obviously, with the extent of that flood, it paralyzed an entire economy. So again, the message is here, basically, this is real, it's happening now, and we need to take action. So from the problem we are leading to how are we going to solve this, and I think also regulators and governments have recognized this as a problem and also as a systemic problem. So what is happening today is we are moving, or in the last few years we have moved from a ESG debate, which you have on the lower half here, which is looking at the companies. Obviously a lot of you know that it's looking at the effect of companies on ESG indicators, and the the concept of the thinking about this is changing in the sense that you are now assessing what is happening to companies by the environment, and you are translating that into a risk perception. And that is basically what the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure aims to do, and its recommendations basically show or imply how to do that. Is they are looking at how is the environment affecting companies. And just quickly, briefly on how the TCFD recommendations work. So these are the 4 pillars that are mentioned in the TCFD recommendations framework. So for those who are not aware, it covers from governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. So it covers a very broad aspect of companies and how they manage these kind of risks. And additionally to that, it also adds a forward-looking aspect, which is very important, and where it differs from others, is the forward-looking scenario analysis. So it does not only look at these risks, what happened today, or what is the risk today, but it also looks at the risk in scenarios, what happens in 2050, what happens in 2030 with the changing of the scenario, with different scenarios basically. And another one on top of that, which some might not know yet, is that the EU taxonomy also covers physical climate risks, and it also covers it in a narrative from climate change adaptation perspective. And for various different activities that are mentioned in the EU taxonomy, it basically requires a robust climate risk analysis and vulnerability analysis, and it also implies the scenario analysis. And of course, this EU taxonomy also links then to the NFDR and also the SFDR. So in that sense, this topic is also relevant for the EU taxonomy and everybody who's touched by it. So, and with that said, I'd like to basically get the first question to the audience. I mean, I should have one slide, sorry. How do I go back on this? Sorry. I think I have one slide missing. Looking for one specific slide, sorry. Yep. So it's for some reason it's not in the presentation anymore. So one very important information about these TCFD disclosures is that it is various different governments across the world have basically covered or are basically supporting the recommendations and have now built those recommendations in the regulatory environment. So for example, Switzerland basically from 2024 onwards, based on the financial 2023 years, companies with more employees than 500 and from a specific threshold of turnover and assets under management, they need to report on these on TCFD and put that into their disclosure. There have been other countries across the world which have basically also embedded that into their regulatory framework, such as Japan, the UK, New Zealand, Australia, etc. So this is really becoming more and more important, and therefore will also, and this is kind of also an urgency here, this will also touch a lot of companies in Switzerland. And with that said, I'd basically like to ask the first question, and I think they're also on the Mentimeter. So if you go on this code again and on the Mentimeter, if you can put in this code, there should be a poll active on there which is asking you the following 2 questions, but I'll leave this slide. And can I show the Mentimeter results after this? We'll just wait a few seconds. So this is This is the results from, I hope, both online and in the room. As they're still trickling in, I guess this down here is the participants in the question. So I think we've stagnated here, but super interesting. So see here, what is super interesting here is that we already have some candidates who don't seem to know. So this is coming pretty soon. So you know, let's look at after the presentation if you're affected by this or not, or let's find out. And it's really good to see that some people already seem to know that if they're affected or not. But you already see kind of, we have a few people in the room or online who will be affected. May I ask them to raise their hand quickly? Great. And then there should also be a second question. Apologies, this is all going. The next question would be, is your company already assessing and disclosing physical climate risks? So if you could go onto the Mentimeter again with this code here. And maybe we can see the Mentimeter again. Let's see the results. Do I need to click? Our slide is not active. Okay, in that sense, can I ask you to show the other result for the other poll? Or I'll quickly look here. It doesn't seem to work. But so, I mean, it seems like here again we have 46% that say yes, your companies are already disclosing on this topic. We have 15% who do not know, and of course, I guess a lot of those who are not reporting also are not disclosing on this topic. So, I mean, again, it's really interesting data for us to see kind of who is even aware of that, and kind of the link here is, it's important to understand that in the TCFD regulations, what we're looking at is what are the risks that the company is impacted by in the context of climate change, and it is kind of conceptually divided into physical climate risks and transition risks. So the physical climate risks are mostly extreme weather events, extreme climate events, which have an impact on the business's operations and bottom line and cash flow, etc. And these examples are, for example, flooding, drought, heat stress, wildfire, landslides, you name it. And so more precisely, it's in detail, it's kind of how productions are affected and how they are disrupted, how supply chains are disrupted by this, how this can actually have damage to the assets themselves. This is what we're trying to look at on the physical risk side. On the transition risk side, it's looking at what is the risk coming from carbon. So if a company has a high carbon footprint and it cannot adapt quickly enough, that means in a scenario analysis it would also have a high carbon risk because it would pay a lot to cover that. It also covers technology risks, so how is the technological environment changing, and basically helping companies adapt to climate change, and how is the market risk changing. Today what we're really focusing on is this physical climate risk. And just one example here is a picture from the ETH Zurich from summer 2017. It's a heat map, and it's basically showing how the heat will also affect cities. And for those who live in Zurich, you see here very nicely along the train tracks, which are the long red line there, these are a lot or substantially hotter than other parts of the city. And therefore, from a heat risk perspective, this will have a higher impact. Now, the question is kind of what role does disclosure have in all of this, in the sense of adaptation, and how can companies understand this and then act upon it. So in that sense, it is a journey, because where you want to start is you want to understand what is the risk. And then you basically, based on the assessment of the materiality of that risk, you can start adapting to it. And we basically just want to show how kind of this, we put this into place. So we usually start with the climate risk assessment, where we understand what is the climate risk situation right now of the company. Then we move on to a scenario analysis, where we basically say, this is going to happen, this is going to get worse, this is going to get better. And then we move on to what can we do with that? So assess together with our clients, what are the adaptation opportunities? What can we do? How can we adapt to those risks? And finally, most importantly, is also the disclosure of the risks. And how do we assess those risks? So it's basically looking at or using data from various different assets that the company owns, and basically plugging those assets into our climate models and using historical climate data plus scenario data to assess the impact across the globe. And we work here together with various institutions, for example, the ETH Zurich, where we use the Climada model to assess this in more detail and assess the impacts. And what comes out of it is basically a risk matrix telling you which location where in the globe will be affected by which peril. So for example, here you have a factory affected by wildfire. You have, in that sense, a ship, or let's say a supply chain, which is impacted by floods, etc. And most importantly, with regards to the scenario analysis, future looking, we are basically also calculating this for a 1.5 degree scenario and also calculating it for a 4 degree scenario. What we do with this data is then help our customers to disclose it in a TCFD report. And we basically help them build not only the risk metrics, so which is the calculation of those risks, but also how to embed that into their risk management processes, and how you can use this information to build a strategy, so an adaptation strategy on this, and what governance needs to be in place. And we'll talk about a lot of this later in our panel discussion. Finally, I just want to say one important fact here is, and you hear a lot about how we don't have the methodologies, the data is not fine enough. So the insurance industry has been working on these catastrophe models for a long, long time, and they are very sophisticated, and the models are somewhat in place to calculate this. They are not perfect, but they can give you a first view about this. And so for this case, I would say definitely the methodologies are in place, and the methodologies are also in place to calculate this in a quantitative way. So in that sense, we have on the left side, for example, the asset damage, where we can see a clear evolution from 1995 to 2100 on the impact on an asset. And this asset can cover inventory, contents, and building, for example. And so with this, we can basically show how this financial damage or financial risk is developing over time. We can also look at business interruption, so in the sense that how much more frequent do events happen, and how much more frequent are supply chain disruptions and costs related to the supply chain disruption to be expected. So in this sense, if you have a historical business interruption that costs per month $2.5 million US, in the current climate, this might be a 3-month event. So it's a 3-month event that returns every 25 years. That means in 50 years, you would basically have this event twice. So you see here on the bacteria, what's it called? Thank you. Yeah. So you would have two of these events, and in a future climate, because these events will become more frequent, you will have a lot more of these brown dots, and you will also have a lot browner dots. So what I'm trying to show you here is basically that how much more frequent in a future climate these business interruptions will happen, and how we can quantify them. So what I want to show to you today is also a quick use case of how have we applied this methodology. And we were super happy that we could basically apply this methodology together with Holcim. And I'm sure Antonio, who is here today, will explain a bit more about the bigger context of this exercise. But what we did is basically we supported them specifically on the scenario analysis. So specifically to understand in a pilot study how are various different assets or supply chains affected by physical climate risk in the future and in various different scenarios. And here again, so specifically we focused on these various different hazards and added the climate change scenarios to the analysis. So quickly on the scope of this, we basically covered various different assets in climate vulnerable locations to start with, and we wanted to look at these in more details. And as Holcim has assets all, or production plants, cement plants all across the globe, we also tried to represent the whole world as far as we could, and we basically chose locations from La Union in the Philippines. We chose an Indian location, one in Nigeria, one in Mexico, and one in the US, and one in France. We also looked from a supply chain angle, we looked at the Mississippi River. And the data that we collected for these locations is basically the latitude, the longitude, so the geocodes where these locations are, and also what type of production plants are they, what type of buildings are they storage areas, etc. And we also, to conduct the assessment, collected the value of those assets. And again, so what we did here is we basically took that input data, combined it with climate models to basically present or have a climate risk analysis of which of those assets is affected by which of those hazards. And we did that for the following different temperature change scenarios, and we also used IPCC scenarios. So we used the 1.5 to 2 degree scenario, the 2 to 3 degree scenario, and the 4 degree scenario, which related in our sense to those various different IPCC scenarios. We used the years 2025, 2030, and 2050. And we focused on the following hazards. So we looked at precipitation, flood, wind, wildfire, drought, and heat. Just this is a first, or let's say, some examples of the results. You can also read up on the results. Is it information where corporates can start planning where to adapt to those risks and build mitigation measures? Is it something where we clearly see, oh, we need these emergency plans in place? Is it something where we would say, or we would stay away from? Is it somewhere where you want to divest? We would always endorse that you would stay and basically invest and try to urge to start adapting to this risk. Yeah, and again, this whole message here should also be the net zero initiatives are super, super important, because the more emissions we take out in a fast pace, the less worse it's going to get in that sense. And this is kind of the transition also to the panel discussion, where we will touch on some of these topics. Back to Judah.
Thank you, Samuel, for a very interesting topic and bringing the debate on of the physical risk. Before going to the panel discussion, do you have any question regarding the presentation?
Sure.
Thank you very much. Yes, just a detailed question on the methodology. Yeah, okay, good. On the methodology, are the 7 sites that you chose worldwide really then enough to give a global depiction of the climate risk, just out of curiosity from a regulatory perspective?
I mean, so from my perspective, it definitely gives a indication, and it is a starting point to understand what is happening, because we clearly try to focus on various locations that will be affected. But I would urge definitely to first get make a big picture and analyzing as many assets as possible, and then to dive in where it makes sense and where we already see high risk to understand it better. So in that sense, it's a funnel where you ideally start with lots of assets and locations, supply chains, and then you drill down in those that are important and high risk to you.
Any other question?
If I may, hi Antonio. So no, actually it was just a pilot, right? So what we tried to do at the time was to start up with something. So we chose those, together with the students team, the most exposed locations that we had in the footprint. But we've got more sites, more than 2,000. So obviously it's probably not a representative sample, but it was a very interesting first kickoff process internally to drive change also on the way how the topic was actually handled. So yeah, let's see how it goes. The panel. Sorry, I couldn't hold this.
Do you have any more questions? If not, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
So what is your opinion regarding how the Swiss companies are doing regarding this physical risk about the disclosure? Because now urgency is happening next year, right? So how is the Swiss companies doing it? I mean, we saw that half of them are doing it, but it's time, right? It's just there is urgent need to do it, not only because of the climate risk itself, but also from the regulatory perspective.
Yeah, I mean, so thanks, Juna. It's a really interesting question, and I think we will also discuss it later in the panel discussion. But from what we pick up in the market is that physical climate risk disclosure is really lagging behind, and particularly lagging behind the transition risks. That's what we hear, and kind of in that sense, it seems to be not on the highest priority for companies, even though, as you say, even in 2 years' time, or in 1.5 years' time, they will have to report on this.
And why do you think it's overlooked, or it's a kind of misunderstanding, or it's a kind of from your perspective?
Yeah, so I think good point. The question is what is happening. I think there are, and we will also discuss this, I think, in detail in the panel discussion. But I think it's an understanding issue. So also knowing about this, and nowadays companies are overwhelmed with various different indicators on climate and environment that they need to report. So it's also a question of resources that they can float into this to understand this and what is happening. Yeah, and I think we're going into more detail in the panel discussion.
So I would like to invite Antonio and Julia for the panel discussion. Antonio is a group head of climate and energy in Holcim. He oversees the group's climate strategy, monitoring of CO2 performance, and public disclosure of climate-related information. Julia is an economist. She has a PhD from University of Kansas. She is working as a research project manager and research associate at ABP Schweiz, and she helps the companies in climate change and its challenges. Very welcome to the panel.
Hi.
Hello. So first question is for Antonio. And the Holcim very recently in April released this climate report, right? And you had also this disclosure aligned with TCFD recommendation where you saw the risk assessment and also the scenario planning. Why did you do it? Because now it's still not needed, right? You still could wait for 2 more years. And who was your audience for the report? Was it the regulatory? It's not yet, but was it the stakeholder? Is the public, or is it for what was the reason, or for the image and to show you are the pioneer? Because I read somewhere that Holcim wants to position itself as a global leader in sustainable building solution, right?
Thank you for the question. No, I think so. Holcim, for those who don't know, it's a building materials company. And as such, the sector, I mean, the built environment is responsible for 38% of global emissions. So we've definitely engaged in 2020 with the Business Ambition 1.5 to have targets aligned with science-based target to decarbonize. What we found is, well, first there is a lot of exposure in that sense as a company and requirements from ESG ratings. So we've been reporting to CDP, MSCI, I mean, for those in the room who has actually done the same, probably you have heard in different panels, for many years. So there's been a number of disclosures we've actually done in that sense, no? We were supporting of the TCFD recommendations since 2017, but we were missing this consolidated report that explained. But it was really more about this concept of it's not all about having targets. I think that's really the first thing you need to do, to have your inventory is clear, to set your targets to decarbonize for an industry like us, but also to explain how you're going to get there. So I think that was a little bit the main aim, was to really be able to explain in great details the short-term targets, the near-term targets, technologies we're going to use, technologies that we plan to use that are not yet scale up. So also bring those uncertainties, and as in Sami, you mentioned about the TCFD framework, also in governance, how we're managing the topic at Holcim, who is actually in charge of it, what are the incentives we have for senior management to get those targets to life, and obviously the risks. That was the main sort of TCFD framework perspective. So we've been, I think the Holcim and probably beyond Holcim, everyone's been working a lot lately in transitional risks. Carbon pricing mechanisms in Europe, 45Q incentives in US, reputational aspects, technological aspects, but we were missing the physical aspect, no? That was something really out of the game. Even on those ratings that I mentioned before, it was a question that was missing. So we engaged with Celsius Pro to run this pilot, to the question on the audience. It was just really a first step to understand how the outside in of the risk is actually going to impact the opportunity. It was actually fantastic to see the findings, because we analyzed those sites. There are risks in those assets that can be expanded and even considered for others. But there are also opportunities we found in terms of climate adaptation, that products or services in our portfolio that can help society to sort of get to a better stage on those frequent events that are going to increase. We've got a new concrete called hydromedia that actually allows water to flow through it, so can help to prevent flooding in some cases, et cetera, et cetera. Green walls, green roofs. It actually helped a lot to change a little bit the perspective. So risk-wise, Sami Celsius Pro gave us the bad news, but also in sense of opportunity, we've changed. And in my opinion, with this stop, it was really the beauty of the exercise was the discussion that this triggered internally in the company. So departments that, to be quite honest, were not closely collaborating in this topic, suddenly I started to see this the importance, and it helped. Eventually, we came up with that report. I think the important aspect of the report was the fact that we put it as a vote for the shareholders in the annual general assembly, so we could get the feedback and be transparent, and we definitely expect to continue this engagement with them.
Thank you very much for your answer. So I will get to Julia. So he said his perspective from the Holcim, right? But how does the other companies are doing? Like the Switzerland, you have, so many companies, I think, and we have also big companies who have to report, and there are small companies. How does it look like? I mean, if you look at the before from the Mentimeter, it looks like not everybody is being proactive and doing like the Holcim, right? So how does it look like? How does the whole landscape look like?
Well, thank you very much for this question, Juna, and thank you, by the way, for inviting me to be on this panel today, and good afternoon to all of you who are joining us in this discussion session today, and one of the last of this conference, but I hope not one of the least, right? So you already mentioned that the question, how are companies doing? And we saw on the Mentimeter that actually 50% almost of the companies in this room and online are addressing the issues of climate change. And we are actually currently at ABP finishing up a study on behalf of the Federal Office of the Environment of Switzerland, together with one of our external partners, Klimahandlung, that I would like to talk a little bit about today. But before I start this, I also would like to say a little bit about who we are actually at ABP, because you might not know us at this point. Our headquarters are in Zurich, but we have global subsidiaries in the United States, in South America, in Europe, and in Asia. And we offer a very wide and diverse array of services. So we offer consulting services, planning, construction, design, communication, and IT services in general, but also in the area of climate change mitigation, and climate change adaptation. We have experts on natural hazards, on water, on location and spatial planning, but we also do a lot of conceptual work. So for example, we support the public and the private sector in their climate change strategies, climate plans for municipalities and also cantons here in Zurich. And this is how we also get to this study. We are also conducting economic analysis and studies, applied research on this topic. So this ongoing study, where we are hoping to finish up by the end of the year, was actually the focus was to find out how are companies doing in Switzerland when it comes to the question of climate change awareness and also on climate change adaptation. We wanted to really get a broad idea. We wanted to get a feel on how do companies perceive themselves in this area of climate change. Are they aware? Do they know what the issues are? Have they started to adapt to climate change? What measures are they taking? What barriers are they facing? What pushes them to do more? What information might they need? So in order to answer these questions, we conducted expert interviews with representatives from companies who are already a little bit more progressive, potentially, with representatives from academia and also industry organizations. And we also sent out a survey, an online survey, to a random sample of 2,800 companies and very specific economic sectors to not just have this deep understanding from our expert interviews, but this broader understanding that you were talking about, Juna, to see how companies are actually doing. And we chose sectors that might already be affected or potentially will be affected, so that are more exposed to actual climate change risks. So we looked at the health sector, real estate, construction, the MEM industries, so metal, electrical and machinery industries, and real estate as well. And it's actually very interesting to see this from the Mentimeter, because from our results, we saw that 50% of the companies in these sectors are already addressing the issue of climate change risks. So they say, at least they say about themselves, they are aware of what is happening. And also more than 50% of the companies are actually already engaged in climate change adaptation, which seems like a lot, but it reflects actually what's happening in the room. And it's also interesting because we wanted to make sure that we don't just look at the larger companies that are really now facing the regulatory requirements, for example, TCFD reporting, but we also look at SMEs. If you think about the structure, the economic structure in Switzerland, right, we have a lot of small and medium enterprises, more so than larger companies. So how are they actually doing in that regard? And then also what we saw is, which is very interesting, when we look at measures taken and implementing measures with regard to climate change adaptation, that 40% of the companies are saying that they already are doing something in that regard as well.
Great, yeah. At least looks like it's going in the positive direction, right?
Yes.
So I have a question which I asked already to Samuel, the barrier, right, to Antonio. Because when you talked about the barriers, it looks like very smooth going, that the whole team has everything going smoothly, you don't feel. So I want to know, is there a barrier for the data or the resources within the company, or how easy was it, or how difficult was it? What was the main challenges you faced when you make this report?
On the whole report is a different story. This case study, I think we're quite transparent in the fact that this is just a start point. And there are now discussions with the insurance team, with finance team, with the risk team, with the response team, security teams. It's a topic that tackles a number of departments, and that's the beauty of this exercise, right? And now, luckily or unfortunately, you can put it like you want. We've been working on disclosing on our CO2 emissions for many years. I think the sector has been scrutinized for more than a couple of decades. We have a strong robust mechanism on accounting. As part of the association, we've been disclosing our CO2 inventories mainly on scope 1 and scope 2. I think it's important to know that because of the nature of the building materials, mainly cement and concrete and aggregates, 75% of our emissions today are scope 1 emissions, okay? So unlike other sort of sector industry that are more exposed to the value chain, the majority of our emissions is scope 1. So the scope 1 emissions inventory has been quite solid since the 90s. That's also why sort of the sector has been transparent through an initiative that was, I think, born as part of the World Business Council of Sustainable Development. It's called Getting the Number Right, so we have to report every year on all our plans. What I mean is that probably something that some other industries are struggling, the basic accounting, we have it done. We disclose it on CDP. I think that the challenge has been more what you were saying on the journey, Sam, is how do you basically get comfortable to disclose the implications of that in the business plan? So one thing is to report your emissions. The other thing is to understand the implications of the business transition you have to do in order to decarbonize. And the last one is to disclose about it. That requires a process internally to sort of get comfortable, mature, and understand the implications, and that's what we've done. As I mentioned, transitional risk, CBAN, EU ETS, EU taxonomy, this is something we've been working for many years. Physical risk, it was the first time basically we did it, and now we're going to sort of become more mature. But the whole process of putting that together, particularly for the AGM vote, it was intense. It was probably not that smooth as I probably come across. It was a tough project, and we were very happy about the welcome. No, I think it got approved close to 90% from our shareholders, and that shows a little bit of consistency with the expectations, which was the important thing. That we're doing the right thing and decarbonizing as we can in the process based on latest science.
Yeah, if I can add there from our side, I mean, we were very well received from Antonio's team, but as Antonio described before, the approach is through various departments, and I think for supporting on this project, one of the biggest challenges was how do you speak to various different stakeholders about this topic and build awareness in various different departments about this particular aspect. And I think that is a journey that where the whole economy needs to go through to build awareness about this topic and an understanding.
Juliet, you talked about this report, right? Did you also look at the barriers that the companies felt or have for this reporting or to get adapted against climate risks, or did you have some kind of results regarding the barriers of the climate risks for the Swiss businesses?
Yes, thank you. Actually, we were also looking at why do companies not really implement measures, or why do they not start to look into measures for climate change adaptation? So the focus on our study was more on climate change adaptation and the challenges companies face there. And which is really interesting, and that fits very nicely into what we've been talking about, is that one of the main barriers companies reported was uncertainty regarding regulatory development. So they are not really sure where the regulation is going to go, so they don't know what they should be doing right now. And on the flip side, from our expert interviews, this was also one of the main drivers. They were saying, if we have regulatory certainty, we have planning certainty, we have an equal playing field, and we know what we need to be doing. So that was very interesting. It was obviously more from the larger companies that they were saying that as one of their main barriers to actually do more. But also some of the small and medium-sized companies said that. And then secondly, which is also important and comes back to how do we actually measure physical climate risk and what it means for each company, is one is the cost of adaptations can be very, very high, and they have a long investment horizon, so companies don't know how to deal with that uncertainty, and they don't know how to deal with the uncertainty about the magnitude of climate change risks, what it means for themselves and how high the risk will be, and what actually the magnitude of the impact will be, and the time frame of climate change risk as well, so when they will be hit, when they actually will have to do something.
So I'll pick up on this question, because you said the company does for the government and regulation, but actually, when you talk about it, it's not for them, it's just to make the company resilient, right? It's just not doing for somebody a favor, an expensive favor, right? So I was thinking, why doesn't company look like for there? It's for their own good and own sustainability. And how does the company felt? Which was they thought it was the biggest risk, or they didn't knew about it, they are facing risk or will face risk, or they didn't even know about it? Or what was your findings regarding their assessment, their feeling of the climate risk to them?
So we asked them if they're aware, of course, of climate risk. That was one of the first questions, but we were also interested which physical climate risks they're actually facing and are the most important ones currently and in the future, which, for example, would be heat was one that was commonly named, changes in soil, water and air quality would be another one. But then also we asked them if they already have been impacted. And in our survey, actually, a lot of the companies have already been impacted by one of the climate change risks. So of course, if you're impacted by something or you think you have been affected in the past, you are more aware of it. So the companies that we actually had and answered our questions seem to have been quite aware.
But they're still not interested to do something more except for regulation. That's irony, not?
Yeah, I mean, if I just might add to that, I mean, so the disclosure is for us, we feel that the disclosure is not the end of it. It's a means to an end. It basically should trigger thoughts inside of the companies and basically set up processes and collaboration, like in the case with Holcim, to drive this forward. So what we really see is that currently it might be a regulation, but at one point this will move then into a means to build climate resilience and really drive the economy forward.
So I will ask Antonio now about why you said you will use it for the report was helpful. So can you tell me give me a concrete example what you could take it and brought it to the next step using the report or your climate report, that you could take this finding and say, okay, I will do this, or I will invest in this, or I will divest in this. Was there a concrete step you took it after looking at the physical risks you got? Because you blamed Samuel that he gave a negative, not so good news, right? So you should have done something now.
It's a very risk-oriented person. No, it was a great exercise, as I mentioned, because it brought thoughts and departments together. I think, look, the takeaway of this exercise is always governance. The whole process of TCFD, I think, is a very smart framework, and I support the fact that it's going to be regulated because it will help all the companies that probably are not that willing to take that leap into having to do it. We started doing it for a number of reasons before this regulation came, and still are doing it. So it's been a process. We've been reporting on CDP, as I mentioned, and CDP has been also adapting their questions towards the TCFD for many years, and we continue to progress, and they continue to change questions. So I think this continues to be a process. But it's a little bit like this presentation, right? We have probably all prepared some talking points in order to. So when you prepare to go out, you basically get better. And you bring connections. So this is a little bit what happened with the process. We basically had discussed about our targets, our technologies, our governance, our risk opportunities, and we put it all together. It helped a little bit to see holistically more how a strategy was robust or whether there was any gap. But particularly on this risk process, it's been always very complex for the company to think, or I think it still is, probably nature by society to be a bit selfish. So you first take transitional risk are more intuitive, right? You have a tax, you have a CO2 price, you have a reputational risk, you go for it. Physical risk, it requires a different thinking process. You need to think more long-term, how my assets or our assets are going to be affected from an outside-in perspective in the future, depending on what the scenario. So there's a number of implications you really need to put into the process. requires to be really mature in the whole strategy. So what happened is I think it follows a little bit a full transformation in the company has been led by Jan Jennis over the last years. Really, climate action is at the core of what we do. And now you see, like, we in the sustainability field, we're losing ownership, so finance is taking over, insurers are taking over, and that's actually that part of integration is what we should see. That's a little bit what happened, particularly on this case study, and also the fact that we have introduced some sort of clues to make it more obvious. So. Going back to the governance and the importance, the fact that we put in place compensation schemes to the top management on climate action, it also helps that everyone is really on board making the things. So it's been really like a journey, and we'll continue to get better in this sort of disclosure. But what it triggered is a lot of collaboration internally and better awareness on the issue.
I just. Not to be the one asking question. If you have any questions, just let me know. I have one question for Julia, and then I will open the floor to everybody who wants to ask a question. For Julia, just like, I'm just thinking, like, if I have some money, just can you give me a suggestion which kind of sector I should invest on? Because you have no idea which are more adapting, and if I want to make an investment. So give me a hint that where should I put my money on? Where should I put my future on? That when I'm old and pensioned, that I still get my money back, right?
Well, actually, I would probably give that question back to Samuel, because with us, we are just looking at how companies perceive themselves, how far they are doing, but we are not really measuring how far and how good they are actually doing and how far they've taken it. And as I said, the sectors we've been looking at are sectors that are already affected. Some more than others, but that are already trying to put something in it, and because they are affected by it, could also be, of course, when you come from an investing standpoint, that it might not be the best sectors to invest in. So I actually would probably give that question to Samuel.
Thanks, Juna, and thanks, Julia. I mean, it's a difficult question. I think we are right. We are at the beginning of understanding that question. I think it's not that straightforward in that sense, because there's a big aspect of resilience and adaptation capacity in that question, right? And in that sense, what I can tell you is that we are at the beginning of understanding of how various different sectors are impacted by this, and also the Swiss government is looking into this topic because particularly for Switzerland, we will be impacted also in Switzerland by climate change and changing weather patterns, changing climate patterns. But we also have a very high supply chain dependency in Switzerland. So what happens all across the world will, at the end of the day, also impact us here in Switzerland, and that's where it becomes very critical for us.
So, do you have any question for the panel?
Thank you. I would like just to know your opinion about the fact that from the last decade we have seen a lot of international instruments for protection of environment, and also the investments in green, in sustainable activities and environmental issues has grown rapidly. But at the same time, if we see the data, the last decade we have the degradation of the environment has been grown too. So maybe we couldn't understand why. If we have a lot of tools, a lot of commitments, a lot of conventions to protect environment, at the same time, the scientific data, for example, the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, the last report says that we are worse. Every day, every year, we are worse. Nothing is changed. Nothing is improving. So maybe, we have a lot of investment. We can do a lot of efforts, but maybe the reason why is not stopping the degradation of environment, it's because the economic interest is the main reason. So what if we think maybe and evolve towards a socio-economic model based not on economic basis, like a monetary basis, because it's, the economic is based in exploitation of natural resources. So what if we could evolve towards a model thinking and manage the resource of Earth intelligently, apply the scientific method for managing the Earth resources rather than use a monetary basis for exploitation of resources. So what do you think about to evolve towards a contemporary economic model based on scientific method applied to the management of natural resources?
Who would like to answer this question?
I can give it a try. That was a long question. I think if I get it right on sort of the exposure of economic activities to natural resources, let's put the example of the building materials. I think circular models are going to be the way to go, right? At least in Holcim, we have taken this extremely seriously. We need to, so few facts, no? Population is still growing. Urbanization is happening, so people are going to cities, more and more, big mega cities are happening. Society will continue to build. Also, there's a number of people without housing, decent housing. So I think what has to happen is that we need to build better, we need to build smarter with less. We need to build from the old. We need to have a regulatory framework that allows that renovation, the construction demolition waste is actually incorporated into build. Zurich is a fantastic example. I always bring it because I love this. Sometimes carbon pricing mechanisms are helping, but sometimes small norms of construction change the game. So in Zurich 2002 or 5, I'm not sure exactly when, there was a new norm that any building, public building, had to have 20% of construction demolition waste in the building, in the materials that was going to be used. And that triggered innovation. Now we've got a new product that is called Sustain in Switzerland, and it's a fantastic performance and low carbon and circular. And it cannot be yet replicated to other countries because of norms. No, so this is something that has to happen in collaboration, and definitely, I mean, for us, it's going to be circularity, but definitely there will be other business models to explore in other industries. I fully agree that that's going to be the way to go in order to reduce the consumption of natural resources.
No problem at all. Great. Would you like somebody to have other questions?
I have a question to Samuel. So climate risks, they highlight incoming threats for companies. And I think they are as well a bridge to show the impact of climate change on companies' business. So what I was wondering, and what seems to speak to a lot of boards and companies, is the financial aspect. And so are you planning on including, or already doing so, the financial aspect to your models?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think I showed one slide where we're basically using financial metrics. So yes, the models can also translate into financial risk metrics that we can use to describe the risk. So yes, in that case, we are embedding that and using it to basically embed it in our analysis, and also in terms of disclosure. That's where I think the TCFD is pushing also to quantify it in that sense.
Thank you. I have just a quick follow-up question. Was the financial part of the pilot with Holcim? And if so, what was the reaction when shared with the management? Besides the 90% vote at the AGM, what was the reaction to see, all right, that's actually the financial impact that we're facing if we don't act?
That's for me. That's for me. I know this gentleman, by the way, on a different forum. Look, it was. I mean, it was not new in the sense that we have. So any company, you have insurers. We work with insurers, and you have. Now it's climate-related risks, but for a number of years you have called them natural catastrophes. So this is part of sort of a standardized process of insuring assets. And I think what the pilot revealed was more the more looking forward rather than sort of a 5-10 years framework into a 50 into those models that they had the high support in them. It was revealing in the sense that more on the financial cost, on the time frame. It was revealing for management, sometimes not always used to think that long term. We're talking about a model that projects you on 2100. So it's really complex for today's mindset to think that long. But it wasn't really shocking in terms of the information that revealed, no? What is tricky and continue to be is how you disclose that in the report and externally. What we have used is the sort of a scenario analysis and basically a quantification method as per your question, because eventually this is really 6 assets, no? It's not a representative sample. So you need to take some decisions on how you're going to communicate to express that uncertainty that also is behind those models. Hopefully that answered the question.
In sustainability, it could be seen that climate risk is actually a great tool to take people on the emotional journey about some of the terrible consequences which climate change is bringing to us in the future. So my question is, was that something that you actually experienced at all? Was there any emotional component on your journey during this project, just by actually going through that exercise of doing the scenario analysis? And if so, what did you do with it?
Can you rephrase it? The emotional side of the convincing or the disclosing or
the terribleness of the risk? Doesn't it trigger emotion to think about the consequences? And can that be used to escalate the urgency around sustainability action? Is my question.
Absolutely. I think what we are seeing also, obviously, recent years, as you were saying, more frequent, more intense weather events. It's clicking somehow. People are wondering what's going on. Those models are getting more prominent. Celsius Pro was probably pioneering this exercise. I could guess this is going to get trendy and expanded to other companies. And the more you see and visualize those projections, the higher the awareness is going to be in management, but also employees, no? It's not only about assets. Probably we've been too much focused on the asset side, but there's also always people working on those assets, where temperatures are, places are going to increase, conditions are going to change. Companies will have to bring new emergency responses, and that's where, for example, teams like security are actually jumping into this topic. So definitely there's an emotional, but also sort of a thorough management side on the safety of the employees and the contractors and the people working on those value chains that we saw in the Mississippi River, in the Rin River. That's the sort of probably the easiest part is to bring the emotion. And probably the complex part is to put it in a sort of an analytical view on how that will trigger decisions in the company in the future.
Last question is on the topic of adaptation. So what if some of the adaptation solutions that you might find make your GHG impact worse? So I don't know, simple example could just be in heat waves, companies needing more air conditioning to keep their production going or whatever. And for air conditioning, there are very few climate-friendly solutions around, or needing to build a dam with more concrete, or these things. How do you sort of ladder that up?
That's okay. So I think that these are two perspectives of the same aspect. No? First, decarbonizing our operations, our scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, will definitely increase or change a little bit the portfolio of energy consumption. We in terms of air conditioning is a good point, but when you know a little bit the assets behind our construction, it's the challenge is bigger. We have machinery that consumes energy, some thermal processes that we're trying to electrify, and therefore it will have to have access to scalable renewable energy. So definitely renewable energy is going to be fundamental. Wind farms, solar farms, which by the way will have to use concrete as well as a foundation. It's going to be part of the risk and the opportunity in terms of mitigation. The second part of the question was, you mentioned another.
Just how it would conflict with your GHG emissions targets. That would actually come to a head.
Yeah, no. Okay, now I got it. So what I was trying, also in the way we're going to see, we change in the portfolio. It's on. You were talking about the dam or any other infrastructure that society is going to need. We need to build with low carbon and more circular materials. That's what sort of the opportunity is actually brought us. We now have probably the broadest range of green concrete, green cement, EcoPact, EcoPlanet that we have launched 24 markets. It's getting a lot of traction. It starts with -30 up to -90% versus normal ordinary product. It's probably not yet the mainstream product, but it's coming. And I think that's what all those norms and regulations that I was mentioning before have to foster, to have a rapid scale-up of those low-carbon solutions, to do the things that we will have to, to put the infrastructure in place with a more circular approach.
Hi. I liked the last question of Ms. Juna, but I will ask it differently. Can we have some key figures on businesses or are critical in the next 5 years, type of businesses, and for you, have you any insight, key figures about what are the challenges of big businesses actually for the last 5 years? Next 5 years, sorry.
So if I understand the question correctly, it's the challenges for businesses to engage on this topic in the next 5 years?
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, so we already mentioned a few things. So, first of all, it's on the governance side. So the having the function is in place and bringing the functions together. I think we also wrote together with a partner of ours a white paper that is also on the QR code, where we reflect about governance and incentives and compensation on the topic of physical climate risk and physical climate risk targets. So I think that is one barrier where companies really need to engage. So starting with the governance, and then it's a lot of awareness building. So as soon as you have this in place, finding the proper counterpart and find the counterparts that also understand and can drive this forward internally.
But I would also say on that topic is when you look at several studies that look at economic sectors that are most affected, there are studies that claim there will be losers of climate change and there will be winners. So some companies start to identify opportunities for themselves. For example, the construction industry, they are very often partially seen as a winner of climate change because you have milder winters, so you can construct more, you can work outside more. They will be needed for solutions in the future, as Antonia has already said, in the concrete industry and so on. So they might have new products, they could increase their demand, they could increase their sales market. On the other side, you might have more sectors that are more losers, that they really need to start looking into what are our options, how do we adapt to these challenges. And coming back to what Samuel said, the governance structure is really important. We've also seen in our survey that one of the measures companies are actually putting into place is integrated climate risk into their general governance structure, to include it potentially in their strategies, in their medium and long-term strategy. Not that many yet, as we might hope we would see, but that's also something that they really need to do. So it's not a short-term problem, and it cannot be addressed in 10 years. You need to start thinking about it now.
The last one, right? Then we have to close it.
So I'm working on helping companies dealing with performance monitoring and sustainability disclosure. TCFD is in scope, and as you mentioned, it's a very big and complicated topic. I think there's a lot of people here that answered that they're not doing it yet, or they don't know. Do you think like how much guidance is required to get started? What would be your recommendation for companies here that want to get into the TCFD topic?
Thanks. I think it's a great question because it's also something that at this conference I've learned and have taken as a takeaway. So there are also companies that are touched by this regulation who are very much at the beginning and on the sustainability topic as such. So the questions, in terms of leave no one behind, you have to ask yourself, so how can you start engaging with them to help them provide disclosure? And they are right at the beginning of it. So finding a really simple way to also build awareness very rapidly and using tools to efficiently disclose and aggregate the data as in a simple manner will help for the journey to get into more depth over the years of understanding what this really means to them.
You want to add something to it?
I think because obviously in your company you're supporting companies to sort of collect data. Data collection is a must, and I'm not only referring about numbers. Sometimes also qualitative data. It's important to trigger discussions, right? So it's your risk management process already robust enough? Does it include climate-related risks? What is the time frame? I mean, there are just few questions that through data collection can trigger change, or at least awareness in the organization, and that's really far before you go out with the data. So my feedback for those companies starting would be to try to gather those questions, those difficult questions that sometimes they feel comfortable to work on because we don't have the answers, and start collecting and start really talking about it.
If I may just add to that, I mean, Sabine Döbeli said it yesterday very nicely when they presented the Swiss climate scores. I mean, we have to start at one point. And in that sense, like Antonio just said, we have to start at one point, and it's not perfect, but we need to start to move things forward. And over the years, we can go into more depth of understanding what this really means.
Thanks a lot. I have also hundreds of questions, but I think the time is running out and everybody wants to go home. Please don't go away. I will say just bye to panels because I think you want to know how your investment went with the Mentimeter if you become a millionaire or all your investment is lost. Before that, I will, before I hand it to Samuel, I would just want to thank Julia and Antonio very much for this interesting conversation. And do you have, if you want, you can share us a two-sentence of a call for action or a take-home message or something you think that to be captured, short and crispy.
Short and crisp, okay. So I think what is important, we've already mentioned, is companies will be affected by climate change risks sooner or later, varying degrees, varying climate risk. And what is very important for companies to start mainstreaming adaptation and climate change adaptation. That means systematically including adaptation measures in the thinking about adaptation into their normal business procedures to be adequately prepared, to be able to be resilient, to meet the climate change risks, but also to gain opportunities and to grasp opportunities that might come their way.
I think from my end is really a message to really don't be shy in the beginning of the process. The TCFD alignment is truly a process. It takes years and will continue to take more years to get it mature. So don't be shy. Start collecting. Start having those conversations. Engage your management. Bring governance. Governance is number one importance in this process. Leadership within companies to make the change is fundamental, and go for it.
I've already had a whole presentation about calling to action, so I'm good. Thank you, Juna.
So let's give a big hand to the team. So you can see now, I will hand to the Samuel and see, give us the good or bad news, right?
So what I want to do now is you remember if you're still up and awake enough, that at the beginning of the session we all asked you to invest on a global map. And now we basically want to reveal and assess slightly kind of where you have invested and how you are impacted by physical climate risk. So if I may ask the team to show up the slides. Oh, sorry. So this is basically where we are invested. In that sense, this is the portfolio that we put together jointly as a team, everybody who joined the session today. It's super nicely spread out. It's very interesting to see where people are interested and would like to put their money and see what happens. So I'll show this map here, which is a map from S&P Global, which basically looks at heat waves in 2050 based on the socioeconomic pathways. And we basically see here that particularly in the equatorial range, you will have, of course, super high risk with regards to heat. So in that sense, from an exposure, we have, we can just actually go to this here, which is basically showing how our investments that we made are now exposed to the heat wave, in the sense that we have a part of the portfolio which is extremely highly exposed to the heat wave. A part of it is on the very low side, but I would say we have a pretty fairly balanced portfolio there. But yeah, in the sense of water stress, I just want to highlight this. So here it's really interesting how water stress develops in 2050. Again, a map from S&P where we see that the water stress, particularly in continental areas of the US and Eurasia, are fairly present, and this will affect. And this is basically the water stress in our portfolio. Again, we have some of our investments which are extremely high exposed and some fairly low. And this is basically the view that we can create and help companies with to assess where would they lie. We would now basically dive into deeper what are these extremely highly exposed assets in that sense. I think what is important to mention here, so we're looking at two separate hazards. So one is heat wave, one is water stress. We also have many other hazards that we look at, but in some places there also can be an accumulation of the risk. So in that sense, when suddenly heat waves, floods, and water stress overlap, then we might have a problem and we need to solve that, and things become, let's say, more urgent in that sense. So that was kind of the reveal of our joint portfolio, and thank you very much for participating in the session. Thank you very much to the panelists for joining. Thank you, Juna, for moderating the session. Any more information about what we do, the Holcim Climate Report is all in the on this link with the QR code. You can get in touch with us through email addresses, which are also stored there, and we're looking forward to be in touch. And thank you very much for listening, and have a safe trip home. Thanks.